Hi, I hope you enjoyed our last panel on ethics. I had so many notes afterwards and so many things to think about. I'll be processing it for quite a few days to come. This panel is on the subject of diversity in dementia narratives. I, for your sins, are going to be your host for the next hour. My name is Jan Carson. I am a writer and I'm also the outreach officer for this research project. I'm based here in drizzly Belfast, and I'm joined by two fantastic guests who are in exotic West Yorkshire, which is Bindi, and also we're a wee bit jealous. Baz is actually coming to us from Amsterdam, so he's our most cosmopolitan guest so far in the conference. Our panel for the next hour is going to look at diversity and what I'm going to call dementia narratives, because we won't be entirely focused on fiction on the page. We'll probably touch lightly on things like TV and film, and Baz is going to talk a little bit more about those subjects that we'll cover in this panel. I particularly wanted to chair this panel because I've had a very intense 18 months of reading. When I began this project, I wanted to read as many dementia narratives as possible. And I think I've clocked up almost 100 different books at this point. So I may be the most well-read person in dementia in Europe at the minute. I read children's books, YA, crime fiction, non-fiction, theatre, work in translation from all over the world. And the thing that struck me very quickly and has actually been mentioned in panels already today is that the narratives were predominantly white, elderly and middle class, and quite often female. And there wasn't a terrible amount of diversity, particularly around minority ethnic experiences. And I have questions myself about that as a writer who's about to begin a novel with a character who's living with dementia. And I wanted to invite some guests who are a little bit more well-versed and well-researched in this area of diversity than me. So we're going to be hoping to touch on quite a few subjects in this panel around class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, and also one that I'm hoping Bindi will have lots of experience of, which is the variety of different dementias which exist. Quite often, predominantly, we see Alzheimer's and vascular dementia and depictions of primarily memory loss. So we want to look at the different diversities of dementias as well. So before we go any further, I want to introduce you to our fantastic panelists. First of all, we have got Bindi Daisy, who is Dementia Voice Lead for Alzheimer's Society, covering North East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Bindi's been with the Alzheimer's Society for 11 years, and she has a passion for listening to the voice of people with lived experience of dementia. She's been involved in a project around creating a resource around enabling conversations with people affected by dementia, and also Alzheimer's Society's local services. In her spare time, and I'm amazed that she has any spare time, Bindi enjoys walks around her local area and testing out quick food and recipe cooking hacks. So welcome, Bindi, from Yorkshire. It's lovely to have you. And my other guest today, who's also picked up the theme of green is the colour that we've all coordinated with today, is Bas Gross, who's Professor of English Literature at the University of Wolverhampton, where he leads the Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded Novel Perceptions Towards an Inclusive Canon. He led the Memory Network, edited the groundbreaking book Memory in the 21st Century, and recently completed his stroke memoir, Right in the Head. Now, sadly, we were to have a third wonderful panellist today, Rachel Hegarty, the poet. And Rachel's mum very sadly passed away just a few days ago. So she's not with us in person, very much with us in spirit, sent a message to me just a few hours ago. But she has recorded a very powerful short video of some of her poetry as a testament to her mum, and we're going to honour her mum later on in the panel. But to begin with, I am going to give the floor to Bas, who's got the most impressive bookcase I've seen in a long while behind him, and he's going to give us some thoughts on diversity and dementia fiction.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for inviting me. It is really wonderful to be part of this panel. So one of the things that I've done in the past is to lead the Memory Network, which is kind of an exploration of how memory, biological memory in particular, is kind of changing in the 21st century. We indeed published this book, Memory in the 21st Century, and part of that is a section on forgetting. I just want to give some thoughts and ideas, maybe for discussion in terms of what we want to think about today. And dementia narratives have become increasingly popular. So have brain memoirs, stroke memoirs. And I want to maybe start off with maybe setting the scene and maybe thinking about what's happening to a wider culture and see why we can maybe think about why dementia fiction is popular. And one of the things that we have been thinking about with Memory Network is thinking about why memory has become so contested and important over the past 10, 15 years. And it seems that there is a kind of a fear of forgetting that is central to our age. There's a widespread lament, or at least concern, I guess, that we are losing our capacity to remember. And this has to do with lots of different contextual changes that are impacting on the way we live. So the ubiquity of digital technology is one of them, right? So lots of digital devices remember for us, store for us. And we kind of unconsciously know this. And it creates a kind of process whereby we understand that our brain is no longer taught to remember. So this idea of fear of forgetting is quite central to our kind of culture, I think, at the moment. And this, of course, then impacts upon our sense of identity. Memory shapes to a large extent to who we are, who we think of ourselves, and how we kind of cognite, how we think, how we live. So I think there is a kind of a cultural mourning taking place for a certain loss of memory, but also the idea of what we are as human beings more widely. The dominance of the visual in the digital age is also quite important. The idea that the textual world is kind of like waning a little bit also contributes to that kind of fear, the idea that our ability to synthesize ourselves through language and syntax and critical thinking seems to also be undermined at the moment through all sorts of different means, and the digital is very important in that sense. So what I think has happened, and this is not meant to be offensive, but people who suffer from dementia have become an important cultural figure that kind of signifies where we are going in the 21st century. They also embody a kind of a collective fear of forgetting. So I think that's something to maybe think about later on. Of course, we should also think about dementia narratives themselves. So I wanted to very briefly say something about my own thinking about this thing. So I am Dutch, and one of my earliest books that I read about dementia is Out of Mind, Jan. I'm not sure if you've read this by Ben Leff. Very famous novel, I guess. Quite early on, thinking about what it means to lose your memory, lose your capacity to think, and lose love, lose your sense of self and social stability. It's really interesting, and one of the things that I want to talk about today is some of the technicalities behind it. It's a first-person narrative about a white person, elderly white person, a man who loses his sense of self. And it's really interesting that we have this story from the inside. And I think the idea of being on the inside and outside is something I'd like to maybe discuss in a second. Another book is, and you all will have known this or read this or seen this, is Still Alice, of course. But the original novel is a third-person narrative. So we see a story narrated from the outside. And I think the discussion or the juxtaposition of the first person versus the third person narration is something that I would like to maybe discuss about the problems of representation. And that's one way of thinking about how can we represent the process? How can we represent our relationship with people who are suffering from dementia? So I think that's really a technical literary problem that I'll go into in a second. There are also two films that I thought are quite interesting. So Alive Inside, I think it was released about 4 or 5 years ago. to me seemed quite interesting. It's a film that explores music as a way of trying to revive people's kind of brains and former identities and memories of their youth. So it's kind of like the Proust phenomenon, the idea that you use smell to trigger childhood memories. And in this film, they use music to go back to people's kind of identities during their childhood and in their teens, basically. What's interesting here is also that the representation is quite varied, I think, in terms of diversity. It's one of the few films that has people from BAME kind of background. So I thought that was really, really quite interesting. And you can play it off against The Father, the new film with Olivia Colman and Anthony Hopkins, where again we're dealing with a white, well-off male who becomes the kind of the central figure and the subject of interest for the brain. And so I think I'd like to maybe talk about that a bit later on as well. But there are two kind of problems of representation. Sorry, I'm an academic in the end, so I'd like to discuss. And that is first that technical literary problem of the ways in which an artist can represent dementia. So we've seen this happens from the inside, from a first-person point of view, but we also seen this from a third-person point of view. And then for me, I'm wondering what the tension is there. And one of the things I've been thinking about is about the brain. The brain, in a sense, is a black box, right? So it is isolated in terms of what we put in there and how it produces the mind, how it produces consciousness. And this presents a kind of a problem for the artist, I think. So you will have seen narratives like John Bailey's Elegy for Iris, etc., which is, of course, an account looking at the process of dementia on the outside. How can a writer use the powers of his imagination or her imagination to represent it from the inside? So I think we arrive at a kind of a paradox. So a patient's experience of their trauma, their first-hand trauma, is something they want to write about, but they may not be the best in the best position to write about this. The writer, on the other hand, usually stands on the outside. So I'm wondering how we can resolve that kind of paradox, if you see what I mean. Okay, so what ways of research, what methods do we have to understand that question? So the second problem of representation is more of a meta-level kind of exploration. And this has to do maybe with some of the things we were just talking about how dementia is part of society, where does it stand in society, where does well-being lie, and what are the problems of inclusion? And I was thinking about, again, about what you said, Jan, about the idea that the white middle-class writer or artist is really kind of occupying the field of brain writing, as it were, right? Because what does the brain traditionally represent? It represents logos, reason, rationality, and it's really deeply rooted in Western systems of power. And Still Alice is something that kind of suggests this, right? It's written by a woman, but she's successful. She's a professor. She's kind of the epitome of rationality. So I'm thinking it's really interesting that the subject of writing the brain is deeply intertwined with a long history of Enlightenment thinking, in which particularly men have kind of dominated how this kind of history is constructed. And I'm not sure how long it will take before we reach a process, we're moving through it, where we can break through that kind of history. It's been going on for a very long time, obviously. But this is something that we may need to talk about, those traditions, those ideologies, I think. Stephen Merrill Block has written in the New York Times about this. You will have known his article about the problem of the aging brain being intertwined with the baby boomers. Right, so it's their position of power that kind of continues to perpetuate that kind of position, which is again intertwined with that type of thinking, that kind of ideology, I guess. So what I'd like to do maybe is to think about those two different problems of representation, bring them together. And what I think we need is, as we're talking about in this panel, to have different voices, have different novels, poetry, etc., from other communities, from the Black Caribbean, Black African community, from the South Asian community. And I know that, for instance, the Alzheimer Society has been making a sea change in talking to different constituencies about their experiences. But what I think is happening here are two different problems in kind of creating that change and creating a more inclusive, kind of thinking about how we can voice dementia. And one thing is really the publishing industry. And I think in terms of literary representation, over the past couple of years, or 5 years, the industry has made a lot of changes in terms of representing authors more inclusively and diversely. But still, I think writers who write about disability are kind of lagging behind in that process. So one wonders how we can resolve that problem. But I think there is a problem here also in the world of industry. So in the world of publishing industry, I guess. So we need to talk about that. How can we spur on the publishing industry to be more inclusive and also include writers who talk about disability? The other point I wanted to make to conclude really is maybe we're looking also in the wrong kind of places for these voices. And I think maybe if we look at blogs, other kind of social media, Instagram, for instance, you will see that there's much more inclusivity going on when it comes to representing dementia. So when you, for instance, look at the Alzheimer Society's Instagram account, that's very inclusive. They're very much aware of what needs to be done to correct that kind of imbalance. And I guess what I'm saying, in the end, I think we need the literary scene or the world of publishing to make more changes in terms of representation. And this is part of some of the work that I'm doing at the moment with Novel Perceptions, which is a research project that tries to show bias in the publishing industry. But those are the two things that I think are happening. The publishing industry is lagging behind, but we also should look for different fora for these voices. So that's it for me in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bas. There's a lot to unpick and think about there. And I think you make a really good point about, the ground that the publishing industry in a more general sense has covered in the last 10 years or so in terms of, first of all, acknowledging that there is a problem in terms of lack of diversity and then beginning to make inroads into tackling that. I don't think we're quite there yet by any means, but it's heartening to see small advances and more diverse voices come into the fore. And perhaps that isn't quite reflected in terms of dementia narratives yet. And I guess I wanted to bring Bindi back in at this stage with just quite a general question to kick us off. I wanted to ask really, why is it so important that the stories that we tell about dementia be diverse and be inclusive? And almost, what gets lost when those stories about elderly white ladies from middle-class backgrounds are the only stories that are being told about dementia?
Yeah, it is really important to have the diversity in these stories because dementia itself isn't just a simple straight narrow path of a condition, that you will have symptom A followed by symptom B. That the dementia pathway in terms of its condition is unique to the individual. Therefore, having that same kind of representation just doesn't fit the bill either. It doesn't actually fit the condition itself because it is such a varied condition. How the symptoms progress in one person to the next will change, will be different. So for that reason, it's fine to have white middle-class people telling that story, but again, there needs to be difference in their stories themselves in terms of how the dementia is affecting them, how that is portrayed. So with that, naturally, of course, you then want to see different people, different situations, different social circumstances of people with this condition and how it affects them, because we will all naturally look to try and find an element of ourselves of how we may identify with that person. So whether that is looking at ethnicity, social class, gender, sexuality, orientation, we will all look for some sort of a sense of commonality. But the one standard commonality that will be there is just the fact that there is dementia there. So whether you're a person with the diagnosis or you're affected by it because your loved one is currently living with the diagnosis or somebody you knew has passed away from it, there will always be that connection in terms of dementia. But I think it doesn't stop there. That's when we do need to be open. It does need to be more diverse, because the commonality will always be the dementia. But yeah, there needs to be more diversity in what dementia is, how it progresses in people, because it is so varied. And I think this will probably then, I'm going to lead you on to another question, which is about the types of dementia and the focus again around memory loss.
And we'll maybe bring Baz in at this point. Baz, what gets lost when the narratives are very kind of tightly focused and just one perspective is shown?
I can answer that in a second. I just wanted to respond to Bindi, if that's okay. And I think about, you're absolutely right. So dementia, the kind of the biological process, the process of nature is something that is shared in its varieties, right? But it's not just a simple thing, as I was saying, it's a black box, but the cultural context is phenomenally important for the process, for the outcome, for how people are supported. And therefore, I think we need to bring in those cultural narratives, those diversity of cultural narratives, because that is just as important to how a situation unfolds, okay? So the cultural and social kind of context is very important. So we need that kind of diversity. It really depends in terms of what is happening, of course. But what seems one of the most common things, I guess, is again that kind of nature nurture kind of a tandem that is kind of afflicted. So part of the memory are going, part of certain bits of the brain are going. It depends where, of course. But then, of course, your own kind of social relationship to your loved ones is also affected. And as I was saying, I guess, and this goes back to Bindi's earlier problem, the problem of identity starts to go, and the very sense of isolation that is taking place when during the process you notice this, okay, you start to notice you were gone for just a bit, or you were losing bits of your memory and bits of your kind of past. So I think that is something that is really happening at the level of the brain. But of course, as Bindi was saying, those processes are completely varied. So there is not one kind of dementia narrative, as you know, Jan. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, I always have my writer hat on and also my community arts activist hat on too. And from a writer's perspective, when I see other writers who are tapping into a culture or an experience that I know, there's kind of a critical momentum that builds where you think, oh, my voice is authentic and allowed to be part of this conversation. And so it spurs on more writing. I think particularly I was kind of shocked by the lack of particularly Black British narratives in terms of what's out there for dementia. And I know that the more people who do write, the more people will write on top of that, because you can see those stories being told. So I think it does that. I also think, as Bindi pointed out, it's desperately encouraging for someone who's from a particular background to see their story reflected. It's that thing that we all look for in any story. where is my point of connection with this narrative? I do not see myself anywhere here. And to see yourself reflected in a story it's a really powerful thing. It brings validity to your experience. And it also gives you a wee bit of confidence sometimes to raise your voice and share what you're going through. I'm going to, I think, bring in Rachel at this point. I want to tell you a little bit about Rachel before I share the video. Rachel Hegarty is a poet based in Dublin. Her debut collection, Flight Paths Over Finglas, won the 2018 Shine Strong Award. A child survivor of the Talbot Street bomb, her collection Mayday in 1974 has received international critical acclaim. And her third collection, which she'll be reading from today, Dancing with Memory, will be published by Salmon very, very soon. It's a dance hall of memory for her mother who lives with Alzheimer's. You're going to meet her mum today, and we're very pleased to be able to honour her mum in this way. This is an interesting subject to be tackling in that there's been a lot of laughter today, but there are also parts of the dementia experience which are difficult, and we don't want to shy away from them. Rachel's particular area of work that she focuses on is working class representation, and we'll talk about class a little bit later in the panel, but you'll hear from her voice and the language that she uses in her poetry that she really wants to celebrate and elevate those voices which come from a working class background. So this is Rachel and her ma.
Hello, my name is Rachel Hegarty and I'm a poet from Finglas on the north side of Dublin. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today at the conference for representations of dementia in literature. Sadly, my mum, she died on Sunday, so today I'll be reading poems for her in person. So I've written a book called Dancing with Memory, and it is a book of 7 sections with 12 poems in each. And the first 6 sections are sonnets, and the last section is villanelles, because in the last stages of dementia, repetition became a factor with my ma and her dementia. The book is actually the brainchild of me and my ma together. When my ma turned 80, on the day she turned 80, I went up to the house and we were having a do that night. But I went up because we were going to hairdressers together. And I lost my memory key. We had important work on it. And I was running around my ma's gaff going, I'm actually losing the memory key. And she was like, just trace your steps. Where did you see it last? And I was like, well, it was in the bag, but I was in the car and I was rooting through the bag. And so she helped me look for it. Eventually we found it in the seams of, the leather seams of the bag. And my ma took it out with a little plastic red gizmo, and she's like, so there's a key for memory. And I was like, well, it's a digital thing that you can put your work on. And she says, I don't need a key for memory. I have you. You can be my memory. Fortunately, before her next birthday, she had the diagnosis. And so I began to ask her questions about her memory, and particularly her memories of dance. So that's where the poems come from. She was born in 1937, so her earliest memories are secondhand. And I said to her, well, is there anything that you remember about 1939 and the starting of the war? She goes, well, I wasn't aware of it much that time, but I do know that your Auntie Kathleen never danced swing again. And I just ran with that, the whole idea of a war broke out and my aunt never danced swing again. So this is where that poem comes from. Swing, 1939. And somehow Duke Ellington made it out of Harlem and right back here to Dublin. Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And boogie woogie blared from the dance halls. Your aunts got in on the action, learned how to leapfrog over hunkered fellas' heads and spin a man back up just to slide through his bowed legs. Bodies were jazzy playgrounds. Until the night before England vowed war. Radio Éireann aired Chamberlain's speech. Your nan and grandad hunched by the wireless. Neighbours came in and didn't even knock. It was September, the end of summer. Your Aunt Kathleen never danced swing again. There she is. I don't have a scientific background, but aside from being from Finglas, I do work in the Trinity Access Programme. So being from Finglas and working in Trinity means that everything I need is always a phone call away. And sometimes everything I want is maybe 2 phone calls away. So I contacted the Global Brain Institute, Global Brain Health Institute in Trinity, and they were very good and kindly explained to me the architecture of the brain, because I never learned about that. And then they also explained to me what happens with dementia and how a bulldoze is such a beautiful mind. But they did explain to me about tau and plaques and tangles. So I made up this thing called, it's in section 6 of the book, all of the, I don't know whether you can see that, all of the sonnets are called dementia sonnets because they resemble the breaks that happen in the brain when those little tangles are cut off. Anyhow, this is a poem when the husband went to ask me ma for blessing the marriage. Table setting, 2006. Actually, table setting, 2002. The empty milk jug gawked and gawked at me, grumbled about how the plastic carton made it look like a fool set the table. Mismatched cutlery just whined on and on. The butter dish gave out stink to the crumbs of toast lingering late into the day. The kitchen roll had an air of disdain and made snide comments regarding napkins. I longed to open the back door, leap over the side wall, hare it out of the estate, run to Glasnevin, reef your dad out of the grave, and ask him why he died on me. Instead, I took in your lovely smile, kissed the groom-to-be, and gave ye my blessing. My ma was very particular about table settings. I should have taken that as a sign, one of the earlier signs maybe. So the 7th section of the book is written in villanelles. My ma always had good language and she had a lovely way with words. She knew how to weave words and twist words. She was a seamstress by trade, but she certainly did know how to sew words together, so they were always something beautiful. And that was a hard thing to see her lose words, common words that would just drop out of her head and not come back. My ma's favourite birds were swans, and this is called Trouble with Language, 2011. Ma takes us to see the thingy-bob's nest, shows us their hidden place in the rushes. The kids race, me and ma link arms, breathe, rest. Her grandsons wield twig daggers for this quest, down a fingless path so green and luscious. Ma takes us to see the thingy-bob's nest. She points at the swans, the birds she loves best. Whatchamacallin' birds in the bushes. The kids race. Me and ma link arms, breathe, rest. This day will end with the sun in the west. Water gurgles over stone. Talca gushes. Ma takes us to see the thingy-bob's nest. We talk family, local gossip and jest. We walk further. An April breeze hushes. The kids race. Me and ma link arms. Breathe. Rest. I clock her last words. Shrug. Don't want her stressed. We make time for the swans and song thrushes. Ma takes us to see the thingy bob's nest. The kids race. Me and Ma link arms, breathe, rest. So as I said, the poem has 7 sections with 12 poems each, and that brings us up to from 1937 to 2020. What a crazy year that was. So I could see the writing on the wall even before the book went to the printers, and I wrote this as the final poem in the collection. This is just one representation of dementia. All of the first 77 poems are written in my mum's voice, with her memories of dance and her memories of bringing up her 10 kids and having the crack, the challenges and the delights of family life. There are other representations of dementia, but this is one possible one. So most of the book is written in my ma's voice, bar the last section, which is the villanelles, and that's written from my perspective. And the very last poem is again written in my ma's voice, and it comes out of her idea and hopes for heaven. No last dance. You're not to be worrying. Da was right. Heaven is one lovely, mighty sing-song. You can't carry a tune? Just dance along. I dance with me lost son, my angel bright. Your da belts out his best ballads and airs. He gives a great lash of the rocky road, and Luke Kelly helps him lighten the load. Me and the baby dance away our cares. Ah, now, stop with the tears. Let go of grief. You know, I'm back to myself and dancing. Your dad's singing and we're still romancing. No sickness here, just the salve of release. Recall with joy my long and wondrous life. Let me dance my way into the long night. Thanks very much for listening to me, and that's me ma and dad over there. So I let her last poem in her kind of words, and then say all that I can say. Best of luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you very much to the festival organisers, and yeah, I would if I could, but me ma needs me today. One more time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much to Rachel. It was a really powerful reading and a powerful account of her mum's life. If you enjoyed that, all of the poems in the collection are that powerful and that beautiful, so I'd recommend getting a hold of it. Rachel does so well in capturing her working class experience and background and the language that she uses and the experiences that she recounts. And it's not something that I was terribly familiar with whenever I was reading all of the dementia narratives over the last 2 years. If I think even in the last year, there's been 4 major Hollywood movies which tackled the theme of dementia. The Father, Supernova with Colin Firth, Falling and What They Had, all great movies in their own right, but all very much about a kind of middle to upper class experience where things like healthcare, bringing in private help to the house, financial provision, housing are not pertinent issues. I've worked in community engagement with people living with dementia for over a decade, and those are not the stories that I routinely encounter in my work. It's often people who are quite anxious about issues around money. And I just wonder why do we not have more working class depictions of dementia in the narratives that we're seeing? Is it perceived to be too grim? What must it feel like for a family who's watching a difficult movie like The Father, which raises huge issues about dementia, and yet on top of that, they're possibly thinking about, what if I don't have the money for healthcare provision or to provide help? Bindi, in your work, I'm sure you work with lots of people across the class spectrum. Have you any idea why there's such a lack of diversity in these class narratives?
I do wonder if it is because maybe it is too grim, and it perhaps brings up lots of other issues around access to finances, access to actual adequate support within the social sector. The term we hear a lot about people feeding into various engagements that we do is around the postcode lottery. So knowing that you need support, you need access to services, but a lot of the time it depends on where do you live, what sort of funds and services does your local authority commission, or your CCG commission, brings up big issues. So I can imagine the frustration actually when big movies like this come out and portray a particular character in a particular social class. I think it's positive to have dementia out there in the mainstream and having these stories being told, because they were never told before. But at the same time, being, knowing somebody who is not from that same social class, it can be quite frustrating because it isn't a representation of you. It doesn't actually match the struggles that perhaps you're going through and your family also is facing as well.
Baz, have you any thoughts about this class issue?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I can tell from my own experience, and that I had a stroke in 2013. I had aphasia for quite a long time, and I don't want to compare this to any kind of dementia suffering, but it was something really to do with the brain. It had a terrible impact upon my life. Depression, all sorts of things were going on. It took a very long time to recover. I didn't have access to kind of private therapy to bring my speech back up to speed as a professor of English. And it took the NHS about 18 months, 1.5 years to get me some kind of therapy. And by that time, my brain had kind of repaired itself. So the point of that anecdote is that there is still a kind of a class problem. And I'm not sure how we can address that. And it's very complex, right? And I really don't want to come down on the NHS. It's partly to do with how funding is distributed, how much funding there is, but also how maybe there's a sense of shame within particular circles. How can you get across that kind of step and try and see if you can get more help? So I think there is a class problem here, and one of the things we should look at is how the NHS is funded and how it can make more use with the resources of the NHS for all people. I think that's one of the key ways forward, I'm afraid.
And I think possibly in terms of the narratives that are coming through, like we've seen a huge swing in the last few years around working class narratives in publishing in general. So there's been a number of breakthrough anthologies here in Ireland. We've just had the 32, which is a collection of essays from working class writers. There's been money set aside and support systems put in place to nurture what, the publishing industry was traditionally quite a middle upper class thing to get your toe in the door kind of thing. And perhaps we need to start looking at similar ways to bring on dementia narratives as well, that, to hear working class dementia representations, we need to invest in working class writers as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so just my colleague at University of Wolverhampton, Lisa Blower, has edited Common People, which is another kind of anthology, which again, puts the voices of working class people on the map. But now the next step, I feel, is to, break through maybe a certain, I was kind of hinting at a taboo maybe about disability in working class narratives. I think that should be the next step. And I think you're doing a phenomenal job, Jan, to push that.
I guess we're sort of piggybacking onto lots of different issues around diversity in this panel, but some of those similar issues and things that have held back writers are very, very apparent in the minority ethnic community. I think it was probably the biggest shock for me in terms of my reading to just see the predominance of white narratives. And there are many reasons that I can think of in my head for why that might be. Some of them around how the publishing industry has been set up traditionally. But I know, Bindi, that you've had a lot of experience with the Alzheimer's Society in terms of engagement with minority ethnic communities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe how that's impacted the stories that are being told.
So within the organisation, keeping representation, keeping diversity is actually at the heart of everything that we do. And it's something that as a team that I'm part of, we're always trying to voice out on. And if people are coming to us with requests of a new project, new involvement, wanting to involve people, we will actively look and seek for diverse people to be involved, because it's not just looking for somebody from an ethnic background, but it's because their story will be different. It will show dementia in a different light. And I know from our storytelling team and our Dementia Together magazine, again, for the last in excess of 5 years, diversity has been key for their stories, for their articles about bringing in different diversity. So yes, ethnic minorities, but again, looking at age, looking at different types of dementia, class, to then even geography. Geography is really important. The amount of times I have people who feed back during some of our sessions, now that we are doing everything online because of the pandemic, it's actually really refreshing to be able to join pieces of work that impact our organisation on a national basis, knowing that their voices are coming from the northeast to Yorkshire to also from London, rather than it's always London voices we hear. It's always people in the central area that attend events and are able to put their experiences forward. And of course, whilst those experiences are just as important and valid, they're coming from the same area. So in terms of maybe accessing to support and services may typically be same again. And is not representing them people who are coming from the north, from old mining communities as well, where class is different.
We're starting to get comments and questions coming in, which is really exciting. And please do fire those through as quickly as possible. Someone has made a comment here that writing, like art, could be a privilege that most working class folks can't afford. And I think that's a huge really important point to make. I work with a lot of older people who are encountering a creative outlet for the first time in their life because they have worked hard their whole life and not had time to have a go at songwriting or photography or whatever. So I think that's a very valid point. Please do keep these questions coming in. I want to ask our panelists here 2 more very important questions before we go to the audience. The first one, and Bindi, you've touched upon this quite a few times, and also Baz, you have as well. It's really kind of you to share your own experience of having worked with aphasia, and that is a part of the dementia experience that some people can experience that I personally, as a writer, find really interesting to work with. But what we do see in these narratives over and over again is memory loss and confusion, and also a very particular focus on a couple of the more common forms of dementia. Many people in the UK aren't even aware that there are multiple dementias. Have you any suggestions for how we can improve this? How can we get different stories out and why that's important? Bindi, I'll begin with you and then I'll go to Baz.
So in my experiences, often memory tends to be the typical common factor for most dementias, but not for all. And as you've just said, there are hundreds of different types of dementia out there, Alzheimer's being the most common type, followed then by vascular dementia. But you do see an increase of now younger people going on to develop dementia under the age of 65. And there's a high percentage of those people that actually develop frontotemporal dementia, where actually language and behaviour tends to be some of the first initial symptoms of change, not memory. But again, when somebody says, I have dementia and doesn't specify the type, memory loss is automatically assumed and people start talking about that or focusing support or strategies that will help alleviate those issues, not understanding dementia affects different parts of the brain and how it affects one person. Even if they are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they may actually have problems with language as well. So it's not just memory, for Alzheimer's as well, it can be other different symptoms. It is really important about getting to know the individual, how their dementia is affecting them. So trying to then lead that into then how do we talk about different types of dementia? Again, it's trying to find more people who want to get involved with our work and our organisation and share their experiences on different types. So we have got a few people who have PCA dementia, which is a dementia that actually predominantly affects vision and spatial awareness and sight. So we have some people sharing their stories in our Dementia Together magazine as well.
Which was, I'm just going to jump in, Bindi, was actually covered in Supernova, which was great to see. Stanley Tucci's character was experiencing visual and spatial issues as well, and that was very heartening to see that reflected.
And I was going to say, a lot of the engagement that we do, whilst yes, for many people who join and take part in some of our national Zoom work, Alzheimer's and vascular is perhaps the common dementia shared between many participants. Memory loss isn't often what they talk about. What is shared amongst a lot of our involvement work is that desire to feel purposeful in life, to be able to do something, not to be de-skilled. The frustrations around people wanting to write them off because they have dementia, not wanting to listen to actually what their needs are. The needs typically aren't always focused around memory. It's about trying to know that person, what it takes me to be here and present. It isn't me forgetting to tie my shoelaces or anything. It's just that support to encourage me to be able to get up and do that and find a reason to get up and get ready.
Yeah.
So those are a lot of the things that are fed through on our involvement discussions.
Yeah, no, I think just to follow up on that, on those 2 points, I guess one of the important things, and this is related to, one of the biggest crises that we have at the moment, which is well-being and mental health crisis, is the instability you are kind of experiencing as a person suffering dementia. You will have a sense of depression, etc. Your relationship with your loved ones, your carers, is completely revised. So adjusting psychologically, I think that's something that we really benefit from if there are novels that can represent what that experience is and how to respond to that. And where should we look? Where should we find those narratives? And I think we should go just beyond the publishing industry, as we were saying, Jan, and we should maybe collect oral stories from people, collating them and maybe seeing how we can get the voices out in a different way. Maybe social media are places where we can find those different voices. So if the traditional publishing industry isn't willing to move, I think maybe we should explore different means to kind of collate and get those voices out there. But I think in particularly collecting the voices, like oral narratives, could be quite important, particularly for maybe minority environments.
I think as well there's questions around genre as well. Like in my reading, I found quite often the poets were able to convey with their use of kind of more playful use of language.
Absolutely.
A lot of things that a straight up novelist like myself really struggles with. So, I'm thinking of poets are very, very familiar with things like white space, the space between what's said. And often when I'm working with folks who are living with dementia, that kind of what's not said can often be as important as what is said. And so poetry for me sometimes is able to create an experience of what dementia is like on the page in a way that a novel might not be so able to do. So I think you're absolutely right in finding the correct vehicles with which to tell these stories as well. We've not got any questions yet, but if you do have a question, please fire it through. I'm going to ask one more question myself. A lot of what we've talked about in the last hour has been quite difficult. We're talking about missing things within the library of dementia narratives and work which still needs to be done. And I'm terribly, terribly aware of leaving everybody at 4:00 on a Wednesday afternoon very, very down. And yet I also know that there is some wonderful work out there which explores diversity in lots of different ways. So I wonder if we could maybe all finish up by, what have you seen that has been really good and heartening, which you thought, there's diverse narratives there, that's intriguing, it's playful, it's doing something new. Anybody want to kick us off? I could wax lyrical, but I'll let you two jump in as well.
I'm happy to share something that is local, so it's different.
Yeah.
So one of my colleagues, who is a dementia support worker for covering Kirklees, which is a small council area within West Yorkshire, a few years ago she had a small commissioning of money to put together a play, and the play was called Me Is Fine. And this play went around various different South Asian community groups across Kirklees, just putting on, I think it was no more than 30 minutes of a play. And the actors were amateur actors. So actually they were local doctors from the two hospitals in Kirklees, putting together a play around what dementia is, trying to build that awareness amongst the South Asian community. And it really hit home for me personally because my mother-in-law lives with me. We are South Asian, we're Indian, of Indian ethnic background. And she knows what I do for a living. She knows who I work for. I've worked for the Alzheimer Societies for 11 years. And she came home to tell me, did you know this play's taking place and it's featuring at the local community centre? And it was, I told you what I do for a living. I told you where I work. I told you what I do, but she's never really listened to me. It's the power of being told some piece of information by somebody else who you regard as your peer. So she took home the information and the awareness learning about dementia from that play far better than she has from me in all these years. But that was something that was really quite special in our area of what was able to be put together.
It's a fantastic example, Bendy. And as a community arts worker, I really love hearing those stories. Thank you for sharing. Baz, what's got you excited and hopeful and positive about in this arena?
Well, I think this panel per se, kind of the idea of talking about inclusivity in this kind of field is so important. And one thing we haven't discussed is maybe the role of family and the traditional family, maybe versus some other forms of family. So LGBTQ and dementia, where you don't maybe have the kind of traditional family unit and as a form of support, but you've got a chosen family. You've got a different group of friends who support you. How can we think about that? So I think for me, that's another exciting kind of way of maybe thinking about where are the narratives there, right? So how can we have kind of narratives about the chosen family supporting people with dementia? And I think that's another thing we should probably talk about.
It's a great point, and it was actually raised by Pete in an earlier panel, this idea that, you know, if you are from an LGBTQ plus background, a lot of folks have gone through that experience of being isolated from their biological family. And so the dementia journey can be quite a lonely one. And yet there are also those communities which you're talking about, both couples and extended communities that can provide support networks. So, you know, I'm thinking of, I thought Supernova was it's not a perfect film, but it was wonderful to see a big Hollywood movie which explored a gay couple's experience of dementia. And the same, I think it's Viggo Mortensen in Falling. Once again, a lovely experience of a gay couple dealing more as carers there. But those narratives are so important that to be able to see in mainstream representation and not as kind of niche things that gets kind of tucked in the side. So those have really heartened me recently. And I guess as well as a novelist, it was really, really heartening to see Avni Doshi's Burnt Sugar on the Booker shortlist last year. A beautiful, beautiful novel about intergenerational responses to dementia in an Indian context. And I'm hoping that will open the doors and encourage many other writers to share their stories. So I guess as we come to a close here with this panel, I want to very much thank Bindi and Baz, and also to Rachel, who's not with us today. Thank you all for listening along and for your comments and texts. what we hope is that this is an ongoing conversation, that the next time we meet and discuss this, there will be much more diversity in terms of these narratives. And we're looking forward to reading, to watching, to listening, to seeing you dance and sculpt and paint, all these different diverse reactions to the Dementia experience. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Our next event tonight will be a fantastic exploration of how dementia has been realised in theatre projects, and it will be led by Northern Irish theatre company Prime Cut. So that's this evening. Before that, we have our cocktail hour. So if you would like to chat about some of the issues that have been raised today, or get to know other colleagues and make friends within this arena, or get some tips about wider reading, you can still sign up via the link that you've been given, and you can get your cocktails on the go, and we'll see you in the chat rooms at 4:15. Thank you so much.